and Tony Nadalin. As I mentioned, the first piece that Nat just accomplished was to talk about what it is, the FAPI profile, the state of its play in the OpenID Foundation. We're now going to talk about why it's important and where it's going. So in order to do that, Nat Sakimura is going to join us with Ralph Bragg and Tony Nadalin, and we'll talk a bit more about the relevance to FAPI, to your work, and to the industry. So let me start by getting the mic turned on. And I'm going to start with Tony Nadalin from Microsoft with a couple of questions, which is, Tony, why is this important? Why is this important to Microsoft? Why is this important to the identity ecosystem?
Well, it's definitely important, to Microsoft is Microsoft's an IDP, right? So we have Active Directory, and Active Directory is a very powerful source of where people actually store information. And so you can imagine that once we allow third parties into the banking system, people are going to have to store their information someplace and be able to retrieve that information from someplace. So you can imagine, Microsoft's interest is from the IDP perspective, being able to deliver, that financial customer or that customer information, right, on that particular part of this regulation.
So you see banks as kind of the start of a set of enterprise customers for this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a set of enterprise customers because if the banking industry is going to do it, you can imagine there'll be some follow-on industries that want to also follow the same suit in allowing the customer control over some of their information. So, FAPI provides a very simple way to do this. I mean, there are other efforts, and FAPI is pretty simple. I mean, it allows you to get what you need done very quickly.
Great. If you could give the microphone. So, Ralph, if you could introduce yourself to this crowd, and in so doing, as Nat did, Nat gave us a kind of internal history to where we got to today. If you could talk about the externalities in terms of the business environment in the UK and in Europe.
Sure.
And how that created this time and this opportunity for this particular piece of technology.
Sure. My name's Ralph Bragg. I'm the identity architect for the Open Banking Implementation Entity, essentially the one that's tasked with browbeating the CMA 9 banks in the UK into delivering a common set of functional API standards, as well as delivering a common technical trust framework on which all participants will operate. And sort of a bit of a segue to, and a bit of a leading on from the question from the young lady at the end of the room here. So this whole program of work, and the reason why it's going to result in an explosion of identity services, stems from one major piece of legislation coming out of the European Commission. That's PSD2, which coincided with, which is essentially Payment Services Directive 2, which obliges all of the banks in Europe to make available all of their services. And you can consider those as a general rule of thumb. Anything that you can do on an internet portal today, so that's access your standing orders, access your account information, your personal information, make a payment, etc., etc., etc. Everything that you can do on your internet banking portal today, the banks must make these services available via API. Now, coupled with that, you've got the General Data Protection Regulation inside Europe, which calls for all of the data that is held by banks on their customers to be returned to their customers to control. So it's a major identity, it's a major data privacy, and it's a major asset ownership shift that's being mandated by the European regulators. Now, one of the problems that you've got with Payment Services Directive 2 is that it's essentially the most loosely coupled, ill-specified, from a technical point of view, set of specifications that you could find. Some elements are contradictory. It's been exposed and has had a huge number of different lobbying groups from the banks that want to ban screen scraping through to existing third-party TPPs, that's trusted payments parties that wish to facilitate and continue screen scraping and capturing customers' credentials, such as Nat's still doing. So when these two pieces of legislation came to light, it turned out that it was coinciding with the UK's Competition and Markets Authority's banking analysis of the banking industry in the UK. And they thought, this is great, we can use Payment Services Directive 2 to really shake up the financial services industry. But the only way it's going to do so is if there is a common standard, if we reduce the barriers to entry and reduce the economic cost for third parties to integrate with all of these banks' APIs. So the CMA order, so this Competitions and Markets Authority order, compels the 9 major banks in the UK to come together to create a common trust framework, a common set of security standards, and a common set of functional APIs, and deliver them all for public consumption, for third-party consumption, by the 10th of January. So it's a huge ask, and where we then started looking around for partners to help facilitate this was when we started exploring what was really viable and what standards were available that we could piggyback on to help accelerate this piece of innovation. And that's where Open Banking's partnership with the Financial API Working Group has started.
So if we've got this right, you're going to create a new standard, you're going to create a certification suite, you're going to create a trust framework with 9 major banks by the end of the calendar year. Ralph, can you talk about the certification piece of it? Nat mentioned it briefly, and why is that certification piece important to the banks and to the regulators?
So, as I said at the beginning, Payment Services Directive 2 it pretty much allows the banks to each come up with their own standard, each come up with their own frameworks, their own APIs, their own security model. It is envisaged that there should be some standardization at a national level, but nothing's being dictated to it at a pan-European level. The Competition and Markets Authority has been very, very explicit in stating that you must come up with a common set of standards. Now, there's no point having a common set of functional APIs hidden behind a wide disparate set of security, a security layer or identity layer. So the conformance profile that we're looking at working with the OpenID Foundation to help create is vital. It's such that we can give the banks and their OpenID providers the tools necessary to be able to self-certify and self-attest that they meet this common framework, and thus doing so meet the order of the CMA or the Competition and Markets Authority. So this is an order that's come down from a regulator that says you must standardize. Well, without the tools being in place to allow banks to certify that they standardize, how does the regulator know that the banks have met the spirit of the order?
So will it be just banks that certify, or will that be an open certification suite?
That's a topic for a panel unto itself. So the legal environment that these frameworks are being built in is very, very interesting and very, very complicated. Only the CMA 9 are compelled to certify. We cannot, under PSD2, there can be no barriers to entry such that we cannot require third parties to go through any certification process at all. Now, this puts a huge burden of risk and a huge responsibility onto the ASPSPs at a time where they're all supposed to be helping to empower customers to take responsibility for their own processes and their own data and their own authorizations about who has access to this data. So in a target nirvana state, we would have everybody certified and everybody being required to certify. For the 10th of January, it will probably be only the CMA 9 that are requested to certify. But again, open banking, we have to go to the regulator and say, look, you have to compel these guys to all certify, otherwise we're not quite sure if you'll achieve your interoperability and conformance outcomes.
So the specification you're talking about is bespoke for the UK regulator, or is that going to be PSD2, or is that both?
It's trying to be both. But the most important thing is the initial set of specifications will be to meet the CMA 9 order with a longer-term view to align and to deliver functional APIs such that we meet all of PSD2. Now, PSD2 has got, if you talk to the legal and regulatory working groups, it's got some lobbyists that are lobbying very hard on both sides. The technical specifications for PSD2 have not yet been locked down. The requirements for being certified as a financial firm capable of consuming these APIs have not yet been made or locked down by any of the national competent authorities. In terms of the specifications as it relates to FAPI, what we've done is we've borrowed heavily from both the read specification and the read-write specification. In the interests of time to market or delivery times, in order to reduce our delivery risks, we've had to go out and work with all of our vendors, get the 9 banks, get Microsoft, IBM, ForgeRock, Oracle in a room and say, look guys, what's possible in the time frames that you've got, that we have, that gives appropriate levels of protection for all parties in the ecosystem, but most importantly, the payment services user, the banks and customers, which is what we all hear about or hear with these programs to try and improve those user experiences. So the profile that we're going to come up with will be about halfway between the FAPI read and the FAPI write, and as more ASPSPs or banks, OpenID Connect providers become FAPI read-write certified, we would look to merge or move the standards and move the security requirements to being the vanilla OpenID Foundation API or a financial API read-write specification. Because ultimately, these specifications need to live on and be looked after by the industry, by everybody in this room, by Nat, who's not going anywhere, long after the implementation entity should cease to operate, such that banks' customers across the UK are always protected and always looked after.
So, Nat, you were asked earlier to talk about the adoption dynamic, and you mentioned that the Japanese Banking Association has already stated their position. Ralph has talked about the UK bankers. There's some question mark about the European and German bankers. And Lord knows where the American regulators are at with this as well. But we do know that the early indications from this administration is that they're looking at deregulation of some of these key identity protocols. So, how do you see this playing out? Can you give a game plan to the folks in the audience about who adopts first and how that might evolve over the next couple of years?
That's a long shot.
Okay.
Well, so UK and Japan is moving to a similar direction, which is good, I think. Germany, I still don't know, but one thing which I can state is that actually all the German banks are providing APIs as of now, although it's a dated kind of things. But it shouldn't be too difficult for them to convert to JSON REST-based things, maybe, yeah. And the rest of Europe is still a question mark. But the banks like Bank Santander or Bank Agricole, and these guys are very, very big in API, so we'll see. In United States, I think it's almost always the case that the industry leads rather than the government forcing, except in very specific circumstances. And I hear that the DDA group from FSISAC is open to adopting FAPI for the security profile. So that will give us a pretty good way into the inroad into the American market as well.
If you could give him the...
Don't forget that the banks are pretty international these days. So as they're forced in one particular area, they're going to try to reuse that technology in other areas. So you can imagine, if the banks are doing business in the US, they would certainly want to offer those set of APIs to banks and financial institutions in the US.
So Tony, Ralph said in his presentation that he believes that FAPI is going to trigger an explosion of identity services.
Yeah.
What was he talking about?
Well, people will want to be able to, use their existing identities or the information. Right now you have to wind up getting an account with the bank, and the bank deals with your information. You got to go through a painful process to change that information if they've got the wrong set of, know your customer base stuff. And so this puts the control back to some extent with the user. So, and what Ralph's getting at there is, that's good and bad, putting the emphasis back on the user, right? Because some users won't know what to actually do with the control that they'll actually have, and some will not care. Some love the banks to continue to do it, and some will want to take control of their own stuff. So yeah, it's going to be an explosion as far as people understanding it and people offering to provide the services for those people that want to control their set of information.
Just to go back on the previous question, for all the I suppose the consultants or the vendors in the room, Europe's a little bit like a whale at the moment. There's a piece of this for pretty much everyone. So if you take the UK and some of Germany or the Scandinavian banks, most of them have got pretty good technology and they're quite innovative when it comes to APIs. But this Payment Services Directive applies to all banks, including anybody that operates a current account. So if you're an Italian bank that's been around for 600 years, hasn't really invested in its APIs, and all of a sudden you're being told that you have to provide an API on your existing net banking platform that was delivered 30 years ago, well, they're all going SaaS. They're all going identity as a service. They're all going PSD2 as a service, and they're all running around trying to find technology partners that can help them. And you have different degrees of that same story from Far Eastern Europe, which have got, for the Iron Curtain, have got very, very little in the way of IT infrastructure. Italy, a lot of IT infrastructure, a lot of very, very old, through to far more Western Europe, which has got and has invested a lot in technology and should be able to innovate quite quickly. In terms of where the industry is going, well, if you're going to disintermediate the banks, the first thing the banks are going to have to do is innovate themselves. So you're going to see the banks becoming the innovators or partnering with the innovators to deliver better banking services. But even then, what's really left for the banks? Well, I see the growth of their identity services. The banks have got a lot of information on you. They've got a lot of your history, and a lot of that can be marshaled into a very, very strong identity. And that explosion of identity services that PSUs can leverage can be used to open up a whole world of other industries and other products that can consume banks' identity services.
So Ned, I heard the beginnings of this privacy element to this story. Can you open that up a bit?
Can just be more.
As Tony indicated, the FAPI will return some control to the user. Yeah. How does that play into a privacy context?
So the first step first thing that you have to do to respect the privacy is to give choice to the user consent and choice. So, that's the first step in the privacy. And a lot of people, especially in the technical fields, talks about the untrackability, untraceability as the privacy kind of thing. But in the privacy community, it's actually the notice and consent, which comes at the front row. And if it's a choice of the person to let somebody track you, that's your choice, and that you have to respect that as well. Some people want to take control of everything yourself, right? Whereas some people might want bank to, deal with everything you should be getting, right? So,
why are you looking at Tony when you talk about some people want to take control of everything?
No, I was, talking to Bragg.
It was
But yeah, so there are many aspects in privacy. For example, in ISO 29100 privacy framework, we set out 11 principles. So when we talk about privacy, we have to look at each of them and try to fulfill as best as we can do.
Mhm.
So you can imagine, basically what FAPI, one of things that FAPI boils down to is a consent mechanism, right, to release the information, and you can imagine there's a lot of other industries that also will want to release information, based on consent. So, you can potentially see this not just being a banking API but a generalized, consent release type of API that can be used, to release any part of your identity, personal information or financial or whatever information that you need to release.
A generalized consent mechanism
For
It's-
release of information.
at scale
Mhm.
on a global basis.
Yeah, I mean, today, OpenID Connect is being deployed quite heavily, and so you can imagine that, they're not going to have to change much as far as their infrastructure is concerned to adopt this consent release mechanism.
Great. In a few minutes, I'll be asking the audience to participate and ask pointed questions of these three gentlemen. Ralph, what's the next thing that this group should be looking for in terms of FAPI's progress in the UK context?
So Open Banking is very, very close to releasing version 1.0 of both its account information and its payment initiation APIs. It's been a collaboration exercise with several thousand banks, TPPs, individuals across Europe and across the world. It is open to participation in a similar way as the OpenID Foundation is. In fact, I'm not sure. I don't think we're even making anybody sign anything at the moment. Maybe we should. So version 1 is due for release very, very shortly. I think it's end of this month. Industry testing. So that's a fully delivered, productionized IDP. So an identity provider being provided by Open Banking, and test instances of all the ASPSPs need to be up and running by October for industry testing before we go live, as we said, on the 10th of January. So very aggressive timeframes, and as always, please feel free to get involved. Feel free to go to the website, join Confluence, have a look at the specifications, contribute, and start playing around with these specs.
So, questions from the audience? If you don't ask questions of them, I will ask questions of you. Go right ahead.
So I just have a question around what you're talking about with privacy. Lots of times an individual customer might have many accounts at a given institution. Do you have any thoughts about authorization of just a subset or a single account for access to that third party? Or is that overstepping the bounds of what you're trying to do?
Giving away, doing this generalized consent and getting it down to the specific attribute, that puts a lot of burden back on the user. So at first we're shooting for this generalized, very simple mechanism where you can give access.
And for the open banking specifications, there's a very interesting distinction, and you'll see more about it in my presentation tomorrow. Under payments legislation in Europe, consent is something that happens between a merchant and a customer. So what we've had to do is rebadge what happens between a resource server and the customer as authorization. Now, that gives two very distinct processes. So consent is essentially something that gets displayed to a customer saying, you're going to buy a flat screen television, it's a black, it's 42 inches, it's got a bezel, it looks quite nice, and I'm going to ship it to this address. And then you get redirected to your bank where authorization takes place. And the bank only needs to know exactly what it needs to know in order to be able to do its function. You're releasing £799 to Amazon. I don't need to know what you're buying. I don't need to know that the TV's black. I don't need to know that it's got a thin bezel, and I don't need to know, whatever else that you consented to with your merchant. However, under the specifications for open banking, at that point, the customer will be able to select the accounts at which this consent applies to. So they will be able to select that for payments, I want this money to come out of my savings account or my credit account, or for all the bankers in the room, if there are any, a business opportunity to present the customer with an immediate credit agreement or a credit loan. Instead of paying from an account, you want to spend £1,000 with Amazon, well, here's a 3% interest rate loan from which you can do this. For account information, the same rule applies. So the third party can select, hello, I'd like access to your financial services history, and at the bank, the customer will be able to select the accounts in which to surrender that customer or that information. We're not going any further granular than that at this point. As to Tony's point, it gets very hard very, very quickly to model those consents, but we are going to give, there is a very clear defined data object model and consent model that customers will be given, and the banks will have to implement those consent management processes and those consent management screens.
So technology-wise, we can go to the very, very granular, each pieces of personal data kind of things. Now, the problem is that it's easy to have the user choose or press a button, but is that valid consent? That's a problem.
Mike, I'll get to you just a minute, but I wanted to talk to the queen of consent here for a moment. And Eve, do you have a perspective on FAPI and from a consent point of view?
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Hi, folks. Eve Mailer from ForgeRock. Yeah, I wanted to maybe just talk a little bit about the design and how it came out, because there was an interesting confluence of needs and wants in the design. The underlying API that needed security and consent applied to it had a design already that is familiar to those needing to do transactions, and particularly payment transactions, that involves kind of a two-phase commit. Can I say that? Multi-phase? No. Two-step process, two-step API. That's actually what I called it in the rationale document. A two-step API where the first thing you have to do is register the details, and then later on when you might want to do a payment, you can do that with the details you just registered. That was there already, and then applying this OpenID Connect and OAuth-based stack to it, it had to use that two-step API. And that's actually very nice for what the regulators needed to see around consent, because the client application needs to interact with the user to gather consent, and the user knows exactly what they want to do because they're interacting to say, look, I want to pay this much for that thing. They do that on that client side, on the merchant side. And only what's necessary to register in that first step can be registered. And then later in the second step, that's where a very familiar OAuth-based authorization can happen. So it was a really nice confluence of design requirements on the security and consent and authorization side. It could be layered on top of this two-step API, phase, step, whatever. So it really came out nicely, and it ended up leveraging a really nice property of OpenID Connect. And I came in a little bit late, so I don't know if you talked about all the technical particulars of that.
Not really.
So I'm not going to talk about the technical particulars, but in essence, it's leveraging a lot of features that are in OAuth and OpenID Connect, which is basically an identity and extra security layer on top of OAuth. So it's good for consent, it's good for people, and I think it's good for the financial world. Thanks.
Thanks, Eve. And Mike Jones, you had a question.
When you were all talking, a question was asked about what might make this happen in the United States. That brought me back to 2005, 2006, when a body that goes by the initials FFIEC, the Federal Financial Examinations Council, Financial Institutions Examination Council, which certifies that banks are able to do business in the US, did issue authentication guidance because there was rampant fraud and they wanted to stamp that out. My question is, I wonder if there's a similar undertone of rampant fraud or potential fraud which might be behind some of these regulations, both in the UK and Japan and Europe, that might actually be applicable worldwide.
So I'm going to split the question into two parts. So in order to not stifle innovation and in order to leave the relationship that banks have with their customers in place today, the role of authentication and the authentication factors that are used aren't going to be touched. However, under PSD2, there is now a requirement to implement strong customer authentication. What that means and how that's achieved and what combination of factors are used to implement strong customer authentication is really up to the banks. On the second point, in terms of fraud, well, it's actually one of the biggest risks that everybody involved in PSD2 across Europe sees. Not so much as this addressing fraud risks, but as another avenue for which the banking community is being compelled to return control or give authorization and a fairly high amount of trust and power being given back to banks' customers that could be a very, very nice fraud vector or a series of fraud targets for fraudsters, most notably phishing. So trying to get banks to deliver new customer authentication mechanisms and credentials that are phishing resistant in time for these APIs to go live is another challenge that each of the banks has to address and face.
Other questions, comments, snide remarks? Yes. I'm sorry, somebody.
This is a question on the fundamental usage of ID tokens, which is based on OpenID Connect. The use of access tokens and ID tokens are highly debated as to why and when they have to be used. Do you have, or when you conceptualize this, do you have a clear requirement on when this has to be used versus an access token?
Thank you.
I really couldn't hear question very well because I'm behind the speaker and all the voice was kind of muffled.
Sure, I'll go ahead and repeat it. I think so the use of ID token and access token is kind of a debated topic in forums. When you conceptualize this concept of ID token using OpenID Connect, what was the use case you were trying to target? And does it hold good, or has it kind of enhanced to cover more use cases, the use of ID tokens?
So when we created ID token, there were two design considerations. The first one was that we actually needed to convey the authentication result from IDP to the right party. With access token, you can't do that. You can kind of implicitly do it, but it's only implicit. Yeah, right. And those implicitness, cause a lot of security goofy things. So we wanted to avoid that, and we made it explicit, everything explicit in ID token. The second design consideration for ID token was that we knew that the front channel communication, that's authorization response, was not protected. that's probably okay for lower security cases, but one of the design consideration for the OpenID Connect is to be able to span from the low security or low risk scenario to highest level 4 kind of risk scenario as well. So to meet that high-end needs, we actually needed to protect the authorization response. And the way we did the way we implemented it was to design ID token to act as a detached signature to the authorization response of OAuth. And that's what we know of as hybrid flow.
Do you ever see ID token as the only token existing going down the line, or still coexisting with access tokens?
I don't see access token disappearing. They have very different use cases. They have very different property. Actually, the audience of the tokens are different, and mixing up the tokens is really bad. Yeah.
That only use access tokens today. There's lots of services that just issue access tokens and don't issue refresh tokens or anything else, right? Or ID tokens. So I don't see those things going away. And as everybody said, each token has its specific use cases.
So speaking of the audience of the access token is the resource. Audience of the ID token is the client. And that's a very big difference.
Got it. Thanks.
Other questions, comments? Good, we'll do a quick wrap up and ask each of the panelists, whoops. I missed a question. Sorry.
So I am new to FAPI, so this question may be a naive question, but you mentioned, Nat, in your previous session that one of the motivations to come up with FAPI was that you were trying to get rid of the need for storing passwords as well as screen scraping. So I can see screen scraping going away with the API like this. How did you address the password part?
Because now you can access those APIs and data APIs using access token. That's the whole point. That if the service, for example, aggregation service gets access token to access the bank data, then they no longer have to store the password, right?
Right, but when you get the end user authorization at some point in the flow, is the user still entering password? Or do you have strong authentication requirements imposed as part of this?
So there's a difference between a person entering their password for authentication and having to store that particular password, right? And the storing is what we've gotten rid of here. And with a combination of potentially FIDO and some other technologies, you can see strong authentication playing a role in here, and therefore, password just disappears out of this whole flow.
So I just went to the website, and one thing I'm not clear is risk factor here, right? We're talking about security risks, the fraudulent risks, the behavior risks, all kinds of risks coming from all kinds of risk engines. The question I have is, from this group, are you looking to some kind of APIs that are able to aggregate different risks and can be consumed by other people for step authentication? Or is that something left to banks as a part of their strong authentication mechanism?
So ultimately it's left up to the banks for the open banking implementation. So even the scenario where authorization has been granted, or you can use an example today, you call up your bank, you say you're traveling overseas, and then you arrive and you make a purchase and your bank blocks your card anyway. The banks will have to be performing behavioral profiling of everything. The challenge for the banks is that, unlike today, where they are in control of the first-party application, whether they can embed some of the sponsors here, threat metrics, they can plug in external threat sensors, they can control that entire security user experience. With an API-led strategy, they lose the ability to profile, they lose the ability to gain all of that lovely context information in order to be able to do continuous risk assessment. So what they're pretty much left with is behavioral analytics. And you've got two things now taking place. You've got behavioral analytics of a third party where the user is present, or with access tokens, you've now got to do behavioral analytics of third parties where the user is not present. For instance, where they're checking your account balance or downloading all your transaction history into an aggregator service, which they may do at 5 o'clock and one day, or they did at 3 p.m. the other day. It's a really, really big challenge for banks. It's a really big challenge for anybody that has to operate in an API-first strategy. And it's where you end up with taking or trying to implement other authentication mechanisms, other authorization services where you can bring the customer back into that decision-making process, potentially using push-based authentication to send them a notification to say, hey, look, did you really authorize this, £1,000 at 2 o'clock in the morning looking from an IP address based in Hong Kong? Other mechanisms need to be brought in place to bring the customer back into the journey to make sure that they are still in control, of, even if they have given delegated long-lived consent. And so these engines and these risk engines are going to become quite key for banks to deliver a successful API strategy.
Is there any push for banking to trust a third-party IDP? Or do I always have to identify myself with each individual financial institution I have?
Can you repeat that? I missed the first part.
Okay. Is there any push to have banking trust a third-party IDP of my choice, of course, rather than me have to identify with a password or something else to each financial institution that I do business with?
I mean, certain companies have come together to look at the strong authentication aspects, right? And so you can imagine, the trust from that perspective gets greater. If you've got some cryptographic operations going on for authentication purposes, and you can tell how that person actually authenticated, right? One of the problems today is to some extent, you don't know how that person really authenticated. It's not carried along in any of the contexts. And so, once you get some certain technologies that are allowed to carry that, or can carry that user verification index or user verification method, you're going to get greater trust, from the banks or the relying parties or whatever you wind up dealing with.
Just a quick segue on that point. In the UK and across Europe, there are already banks leveraging external IDPs for automatic account opening and provisioning. So level of assurance 2, such as the UK's Verify program, can be used to open bank accounts. They are trying to roll that out across Europe, such that a Spanish citizen, if they can be appropriately assured by a Spanish IDP, can open a bank account inside the UK. What you then struggle with is that those LOA2 identities don't usually meet the requirements for, as you said, authentication, such that they would meet LOA3 for ongoing account access. If you had better knowledge of the authentication mechanisms that took place, like potentially the new vectors of trust framework that is coming out through the IETF, you could start seeing banks leverage or offer external authentication services. Put your banker's hat on for a second though. If I'm going to offer an external authentication service and I no longer have a digital engagement strategy for engaging with my customers, how much of the customer relationship experience is really left? Not much at all. So instead, what I can see is banks investing heavily inside their own authentication services to make the security experience as swift, as fast, as engaging as possible, so they can then build on that security engagement platform to offer the existing ancillary services, marketing, advertising, et cetera, that they have lost or potentially will lose when these platforms go, or these API banking as a platform services take off.
and to comment on what Ralph said here is, you know, he mentioned the UK Verify, and you can imagine that, you know, if the UK Verify could provide, you know, could be the IDP for banks, you know, if it's good enough for the government, it's going to be, you know, probably pretty good enough for the banks to be able to trust, right? They've got your, you know, Verify's got your, or pieces that sit behind Verify have your passport number and all that, you know your customer types of information. So you can imagine this little ecosystem starting to form where, you know, the banks can also participate in supplying identities and attributes, and, you know, Verify can provide them, and so you've got this little ecosystem of very strong attributes that are going to exist.
Thank you.
Quick question on, do you see the need to encrypt certain attribute elements in the OIDC flow at all for FAPI?
Could you please speak up, please?
Do you see the need to encrypt certain attribute elements in the OIDC flow for FAPI? User info elements needing to be encrypted, maybe?
So the FAPI rewrite specification does actually do, does it mandate encryption or support? And it doesn't mandate it, but it says recommends, essentially, should, I think it should. Yeah, it should support encrypted ID tokens.
But what about
end-to-end.
insert, you know, if you think about the user info endpoint and elements, the scopes in there, what about those?
Well, in order to access the end user info endpoint, you should have had if you follow FAPI spec, you should have had an access token with that was appropriately tied to the token binding to the channel, and the response should be coming over MATLS. It's a very interesting, if I take that, your question one step further, I suppose you could look at it, even though you've got the authorization layer all sorted out, let's look at the resources that we're serving. Do those resources need to be signed and encrypted even though the authentication and authorization layer is in place? That question is being actively debated now at the Open Banking Security Working Group as to whether or not we mandate either full-signed JWT payloads, both requests and responses, or some form of detached signature on and above the authorization layer. So watch this space.
Perfect. That was the question I was looking for. Thanks.
I'd like a number from each of you. It's 10 years in the future. You want to keep separate. Maybe, maybe not. Your financial, your work, your social media. How many identity providers do each of you have? One?
How many years?
What?
How many years?
So was your question how many?
How many identity providers will each of you
Okay,
have?
so, or,
let's say 7 years.
I mean, 7 years to now or 7 years from now? Okay. Now, just taking the question broadly, identity provider often means very, very specific things. But, okay, I have over 600 passwords. That shows you the scale of what is being done here. Now, for identity provider that federates the systems, I think I use only 5 or something like that. Yeah.
4.
Quite a few, but this brings in the question of, will IDPs really exist in the future, and if they just become, attribute aggregators instead of really IDPs. So you're not really depending on a single source for identity. You know, you've got generalized aggregators that, you know, wind up picking, you know, from the same set of attributes that exist out there. So it's really going to be, you know, how many attribute providers are going to be, you know, are going to be out there. You mean the international airline IAG? Yeah. So, you know, as part of when we were over in the UK talking to the Open Banking Ltd, we also were talking with the International Airline Group, IAG, which is, BA is a big member of IAG, and I think there's a total of 5 airlines that belong to this. And they also have a similar situation where they want to be able to, you know, have the customer release information such as, you know, when they have an issue trying to find out who the passenger really is. And they have regulations that they get fined quite a bit if they got the passenger's name incorrect and other things that deal with the passenger, or the passenger's on the wrong plane. And if that passenger lands in a different country that he was not supposed to land in, or a different place that they're not supposed to land in, the airlines get fined here. And so there's a lot of action that goes on, you know, 30 minutes before your flight, and to verify all the passengers and all the passenger information. And so you can imagine that, you know, that the airline group is interested in things that may come from, you know, the UK Verify system, such as passport and other things, and now they would need a release mechanism that the passenger can say, yeah, here's, you know, I'm going to give consent to go ahead and release my information that sits behind Verify over to British Airways, and then, you know, that reduces their cost quite a bit, right? Because they've got people actually going down through the list and verifying that all the information of each passenger is correct. So this just is another industry that can use this technology very easily.
Final thoughts?
So for the finance, you know, FAPI started as a financial stuff, like I said, but you know, the original concept was CX, contract exchange, which spans all industry. Yes. I mean, when we started FAPI, that was too big a chunk to bite, so we just concentrated on the financial stuff. But soon enough, other use cases comes up, right? So, you know, I think there is a very solid demand for higher security use cases, and we could leverage FAPI for that.
Personally, I echo that point, but I would see the older, less secure models or ways of working dying out, becoming less supported even by the social media and interactions. There's no reason, with the amount of money and the amount of innovation and the cheapness of compute, really now not to be applying some of the FAPI security standards to all interactions.
Thank you all for your attendance, and how about a round of applause for our panelists? There we go. You'll see other presentations that talk about FAPI in different contexts throughout the week. We encourage you to attend those if you like. By all means, join the group, both the OpenID Foundation's FAPI working group, but also the Open Banking Ltd working group. So we encourage your participation and look forward to talking to you more this week. Thanks.